Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll tell you, this is a real pleasure to be here with some of you who I have not yet met before, but as I look out, I'm seeing an awful lot of friends in the crowd and people I have worked with on a number of projects. I really appreciate, and I'm not just saying that, I really appreciate this opportunity to share with you my vision on how our cities and our state can work in partnership to address some of the largest challenges confronting us. Fortunately for both of us, I will enter the governor's office with experience of what it's like to address significant challenges on a local level. As was mentioned, for 8 years, I served as a King County, Seattle Port Commissioner. And in that capacity, I worked with cities all across King County on a broad variety of issues, from tourism promotion and economic development, to habitat development and pollution reduction, to transportation and land use. For many of those years, I also served on the executive committee of the Puget Sound Regional Council and was able to see the potential for coordination and partnership among cities, counties, port districts, and the state. And I also served on the Puget Sound Partnership's Ecosystems Board and saw the potential for diverse groups and government entities to come together in partnership in pursuit of common goals. I took away from all of those experiences the understanding that while the state can and should be a catalyst in pulling people together and forging partnerships, successful partnerships give local governments the flexibility to meet goals in ways that make sense in their community. The state giving local governments the flexibility to meet goals in ways that fit their community also requires the state giving local governments the funds they were counting on to meet those goals. Let me state that clearly, and this is based on my experience as a locally elected official, that a true partnership between the state and local governments needs to be founded on the state's respect for dollars dedicated for specific purposes. For cities and ports and counties to plan for the growth that we all know is coming, you need as much budget certainty as you can get. If funds promised to local law enforcement are swept by the state for another purpose, law enforcement still needs to be funded by the city. If MOCTA funds that a local government was counting on to finance cleanup or a stormwater project are swept, the needed project either gets delayed or another project suffers. If public works funding is swept by the state, either deferred maintenance mounts or a local priority gets defunded. The state, sweeping dedicated funds, undermines local government's ability to make the investments needed to serve citizens and prepare for imminent growth. If you want a governor who gets it, I get it. I also understand that Washington cities have many priorities, ranging from economic development to public records rules to personnel requirements. And I don't want to minimize the importance of any of those issues. But in our limited time today, I want to discuss 4 other issues that are important to me and to both of us. In my first term, I commit to you that I will forge even more meaningful state-city partnerships in 4 areas. They are stormwater treatment, transportation, public service infrastructure, and homelessness. The first is stormwater. It is on my bucket list. Some of you might have heard me talking about this. Those who have worked with me on Puget Sound partnership issues know this. It's on my bucket list that at the end of my life, Puget Sound will be healthier than it was when I was born. That will require restoring salmon and steelhead populations. And that requires we minimize and treat stormwater. As a commissioner, I stared, as probably some of you have stared, at the staggering cost estimates for water treatment projects. But I've also learned, both as a board member on an environmental nonprofit and as a commissioner, that there are less expensive options to treating stormwater. For years, I was involved in a nonprofit that worked in communities like West Seattle and Puyallup, experimenting with rain gardens and sidewalk landscaping as a means of reducing stormwater in the system. Some approaches work better than others. Some ideas worked in one area, but not in another. And I learned that just because a concept doesn't work well enough everywhere to be considered a single uniform approach doesn't mean it should be abandoned. It just means we need to develop more approaches. And in a true partnership, the state will encourage local flexibility and innovation. Similarly, as a port commissioner, I saw in Tacoma a dumpster-sized planting garden that actually was capturing water off industrial roofs and filtering it. And I helped establish a similar project in Seattle at Pier 91, where we had very high levels of heavy metals coming off industrial roofs. And after 1 year of capturing this rainwater in these garbage dumpster-sized specific planted gardens and filtering it, after 1 year in these splash boxes, we had reduced the heavy metals that would have been going into stormwater by thousands of times. And it was cheap. Both projects, the residential and the commercial industrial ones, both of these projects are not going to replace the need for significant municipal investments in stormwater treatment. But they have driven home to me that reducing the amount of stormwater entering the system should be a component of a successful stormwater partnership. So should protecting MOCTA funds. Restoring Puget Sound will be a priority for my administration, and stormwater partnership with cities, developing a working stormwater partnership with the cities, will be a critical element of that emphasis. The second area where I'd like to have your partnership is on transportation. As a commissioner, I work very closely with Governor Gregoire and Governor Gregoire's office on transportation policy and projects, and I saw how funds can be leveraged when the state and local governments share priorities, planning, and resources. During my 8 years on the commission, the port and the state and cities worked collaboratively on numerous grade separation projects that enabled us to move cargo in and out of the port and to keep middle-class jobs here in Washington state. But I also know from working with the governor that more of a partnership is needed with cities. And one area where that is particularly apparent is in the maintenance of truck routes. When I began working at the port and when I was running for office at the port, I talked about how we had $90 million in deferred maintenance on truck routes right here in South King County, North Pierce County. $90 million. 8 years later, I would love to tell you that it's better. I'd love to tell you it's the same, but it's gotten worse. We now have over $110 million in deferred maintenance on truck routes that are essential to the efficient operation of the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. And at some point, that figure won't just continue to gradually increase, it's going to escalate, because we're not going to any longer be able simply to repair those truck routes, but we're going to have to entirely replace them. In many cases, particularly in cities that have warehouses, which is true here in South King and North Pierce counties, sales tax distribution leaves these cities with the burden of maintaining these truck routes, but not with the revenue to maintain them. This creates a disincentive for these cities and near the ports to permit new warehouse space, even as the ports are investing to accommodate more freight. That disconnect calls out for a state partnership, and it's one I want to provide. Corridors, if you like that, you'll love this. Corridors that are important to the state's economy. And these are the corridors like West Valley and other truck routes. Corridors that are important to the state's economy and to keeping jobs in Washington should be considered corridors of statewide significance. And rather than balkanized into multiple municipal responsibilities, the state should make provision for maintaining that statewide significant infrastructure. The third area for partnership is public service infrastructure. It's similar to stormwater because the price tags can be staggering and too often anticipated funds are swept from their dedicated purpose. And it's similar to transportation because failing to address these needs does not make them go away. It only makes them bigger, possibly generating even greater demands on future state capital budgets. Ensuring we have power, water, and sewer systems that not only safely and efficiently meet the needs of current citizens, but are also being developed and upgraded to accommodate future growth is essential to protecting public health and safety, encouraging economic development, and enhancing our quality of life. That requires protecting the Public Works Fund. And finally, I want to talk to you about an issue that I care passionately about, and it's the fourth area that I welcome your partnership. I actually wish we could spend the entire time this morning talking about it. It's an issue that is so important to me that I've asked the governor to join me in a 1-hour debate dedicated only to it, and that issue is homelessness. It is one of the biggest issues I see facing cities today. It encompasses the issues of affordable housing, drug addiction, mental health, and education. My interest in the issue of homelessness began long before I ever ran for public office. I served as a volunteer night manager at a winter shelter at my church. And over the course of this campaign, I have talked with mayors and sheriffs and homeless advocates all across the state. And as a result, I've come to understand how homelessness has and hasn't changed since I worked in the shelter 10 years ago. When I worked in the shelter, and this was between 2004 and 2006, and I would work once or twice a month during the winter. I'd manage the shelter overnight for once or twice a month. When I worked in the shelter between 2004 and 2006, I learned a great deal about a homeless population that was comprised largely of people who were trying to put their lives back together. Many had jobs. I can remember guys saying, "Bill, will you wake me up at 5:30? We didn't turn the lights on until 6, but they wanted to be woken at 5 or 5:30 because they wanted to get on a bus to get out to the suburbs where they had a job." Many of them had jobs, and they were using the shelter as a transition point to secure more permanent housing and some services they needed and some stability in their life. And those people are still with us. But there's another homeless population, which is different. And I don't want this second population to become the face of homelessness. But there's another homeless population I have seen after visiting many of the encampments around our state, and particularly here in Seattle. And we have to recognize that many of these people do not want help. And far too often there is an element of heroin and drug addiction, prostitution, and criminality, which makes these camps unsafe for those who are in them and for the surrounding community. And ladies and gentlemen, relegating these populations, these people, to the margins of society by enabling them to live in tents and boxes and on public land is not progressive. It is cruel. Different homeless populations have different needs and require different solutions. But I've come to learn over these last months what is absolutely needed is leadership from the governor's office and a solid working partnership between the cities and the state. Failing that, we're just going to move the problem around. So here's what I would like to do. During the transition, I'm going to convene a conference of mayors, city council members, homeless-oriented nonprofits receiving state funds, and local law enforcement officials. This conference will identify how we can better coordinate housing, drug addiction, mental and primary health programs to serve different homeless populations in different ways. This group will help develop the new Department of Social and Health Services Secretary's work plan for the first 2 years. That plan needs to identify how we can better integrate primary care and mental health care in non-emergency room settings. Now, many of you, I've talked to several of you, and some of you have taught me a lot about this. Many of you are in your cities developing models that combine crisis, medical, behavioral, and addiction assistance in a locally focused network of care, an integrated, locally focused network of care. And what I want this conference to do is to identify which of those projects that many of you already have underway in your cities can be scaled up on a regional or a statewide basis. Third, I'm going to appoint a Secretary of Social and Health Services who understands that she or he will be held accountable for developing a successful partnership with the cities, and that success will be defined after 36 months as a tangible reduction in our homeless populations. And I'm going to announce a zero tolerance for people living in boxes and tents on state land and give local law enforcement the jurisdiction to remove these camps. Beyond those measures, reducing homelessness particularly in the long term, is going to require rebuilding our mental health system. Washington is ranked 50th in providing mental health to adults, 47th overall. Let that sink in. We're better than that. Western State Hospital is the worst, or possibly the best, example of Governor Inslee's managerial incompetence. Western State Hospital failed 4 federal audits, and the governor did nothing. It wasn't until dangerous patients escaped that he came to life. And then he withdrew Western State's federal accreditation before it could be revoked and told no one. Management continued to recruit new staff, promoting Western State Hospital as a federally accredited, fully accredited hospital when it was not. In our debate on August 17th in Spokane, Western State Hospital was discussed, and the governor never once mentioned that it had lost its accreditation. Its federal certification now hangs in peril. It is a failed institution and at risk of losing $65 million in federal funding. Now, Western State Hospital is the backbone of our mental health system. And while a well-functioning hospital does not provide for a functioning mental health system in our city streets, the withdrawal of federal funding of Western State would have serious ramifications on our ability to handle some of the most dangerous and vulnerable amongst us. So what needs to happen? Well, we need to embrace the bipartisan reforms that Governor Inslee vetoed. These reforms would not have only set Western State Hospital on a pathway to recovery and re-accreditation, but would have begun to shift resources towards more community-based mental health care all across Washington State. Second, 2 consulting groups have completed assessment reports on Western State Hospital. The governor should release those consultants' reports to the staff and to the legislature. They cannot fix the problem until they understand them. Third, the governor's office needs to immediately disclose the number of on-call staff they rely on, that Western State Hospital relies on, and the amount of overtime that is being billed. The amount of money spent in recent years on administrative staff versus patient care staff also needs to be disclosed. Developing an understanding of how much additional staff are needed cannot be done until there is a clear understanding of how much is being spent on personnel now. But a governor who truly wants to get at the root cause of the rise of homelessness should begin at the beginning, and that's education. Remember when I stated that Washington State is ranked 50th in providing health care to adults? That abysmal ranking is not entirely due to our broken mental health delivery system or to the state of Western State Hospital. A significant negative in the composition of that 50th ranking was due to our high school dropout rate. We live in a state where 20 to 25% of our 9th graders will not graduate from high school. And those who drop out are much more likely to experience poverty and health problems. The likelihood of being homeless increases, and following homelessness can come mental health and primary care needs, drug addiction, and sometimes incarceration. To put it bluntly, we have a choice. The state and the cities can spend hundreds of millions of dollars building jails and detox centers and methadone clinics and emergency shelters, or we can keep kids in high school. I want to keep kids in school, and I'll need your partnership to do that. In me, you are going to have a governor who knows what it is like to be a local government official, dealing with unfunded mandates, having revenue you were counting on swept away, having new regulations imposed without direction or an appreciation of other priorities. But more importantly, in me, you are going to have a governor who is engaged, working alongside you on problems like stormwater, transportation, infrastructure, and homelessness. If you want that sort of engaged governor, I give you my commitment that is the kind of governor I will be. And I welcome your partnership over the next 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We have a few questions for you. Okay, thank you. This one's on economic development and infrastructure. Cities are where most of the state's economic activity occurs. Our state needs a strong city-state partnership that helps direct and manage job growth in ways that maintain and enhance the quality of life for our residents and businesses. With that in mind, please share one or more specific ideas about how your administration could reduce regulatory cost to spur development or redevelopment in cities while maintaining a community's quality of life and overall regulatory autonomy.
That's just sitting a softball right across, slow pitch right across the plate. Because I've talked to many of you and a lot of your colleagues about the regulatory regime that we have in Washington State. And it's interesting how the comments I get from the public sector oftentimes mirror the comments about our regulatory regime that I hear from the private sector. Both are complaining about the accumulation of regulations without a reassessment of whether or not they're moving us in any particular direction. Both are complaining about the times they're receiving regulations that appear to be contradictory, being enforced by different agencies and trying to figure out what they're supposed to be doing. So what I have said and this applies both to the public and to the private sector, on day one, I'm going to announce a moratorium on all new regulations until the departments can justify the ones that we've already got. And part of this review is going to be looking at why we have this regulation in the first place. What is its objective? How do we measure success? This regulation is working if what happens, and how do we measure that? If this is successful, what looks different in 4 or 10 years? And what is the legislative authority that gives you the ability to implement that regulation? That is not an effort to slash and burn. It's an effort after decades to step back and say, do we have the regulations that are really enabling cities or the private sector to generate jobs and create economic development? Or do we have programs that are contradictory? Or do we need to change regulations to unleash some of the power and potential that exists in our cities? That review, I think, will give us the direction we need, and I hope we can conclude it in 1 year, that we need to go forward with 3 years and work with the cities and the private sector on a regulatory regime that will help generate jobs.
The next question is on revenue flexibility. We have gone through boom and bust economic cycles of late at both the state and local level. Overall, revenues are growing again, but not evenly or everywhere. Service demands are up at all levels of government, and the state controls how cities can raise revenue and where those revenues can be allocated. With that in mind, would you support exploring opportunities for new local revenue options and/or removing caps or restrictions on existing sources? If so, any thoughts on which one or ones, and if not, why not?
No, I'm open to exploring all options. I mean, as a local government official, I know that there are times when resources simply do not match the needs of the local community. And again, I'm open to alternative ways of funding those projects. On the other hand, I also know that if MOCTA funds on a few occasions had not been swept, I'd probably been in a position to actually lower property taxes even more than we did. But what we have too often is the state sweeping our dedicated funds, and so then projects that should be funded by the gas tax or by other dedicated taxes for specific purposes get pushed onto ports or local governments, and we have to indirectly fund those through property tax or other tax means. Let's make sure the state's living up to its side of the partnership by protecting those dedicated funds.
Next question's on mental health and human services. The state's mental health system is woefully underfunded, as you mentioned earlier, ranking 47th out of 50 states in one measure. Cities have increasingly been on the front lines when it comes to serving and interacting with individuals facing severe mental illness and impacts of ever-increasing opioid addiction. Our police officers are becoming de facto mental health case counselors and case managers, and our jails mental health hospitals. How would you propose working to ensure these underserved populations are getting the help they need, and how would you support cities as we respond to that crisis?
Well, I've really been, I don't know if shocked, but disheartened and to watch this, the explosion of homelessness. And I worked on it in 10 years ago, it was very much a more urban issue. Now cities, and I don't need to tell you all this, but cities like Auburn, Spokane, Federal Way, Puyallup, Wenatchee, Walla Walla, Vancouver are all struggling with this issue. That is why I want to convene during the transition this conference of mayors and city council people and law enforcement officials and all of the homeless advocates that are receiving state funding. And let's figure out how we can put together a statewide program and partnership. In the beginning of this campaign, I thought this isn't really a state issue. I thought it was a municipal issue and that there really wasn't a role for the state. And as I have gone around and talked to many people in cities around Washington state, I've learned that if we do not have a comprehensive statewide approach, if we don't have leadership out of the governor's office, we're just going to play whack-a-mole and we will be moving the problem around. And so when I talk about how we need to increase funding, how we need to increase the integration of primary and mental health facilities, how we need to integrate law enforcement into the provision of those so they can determine when someone is actually conducting criminal activity and actually needs mental health care, that's the kind of initiative we need to have emerge from this partnership. And most of you are already doing it. I mean, there are great models that are being created, and I'm aware of some in Wenatchee and in the Tri-Cities and in Vancouver, where we're beginning to more closely integrate the delivery of primary and mental health care at the local level. There are initiatives and small-scale projects where law enforcement are becoming much more involved with mental health care providers. Those projects, we need to identify which of those are working and which can be scaled up on a statewide and regional basis. And I welcome your partnership in doing that.